Well, it's the first Sunday in Lent. And as you can see, we've started redecorating a little bit to remind ourselves, to help ourselves approach Easter in this time of Lent. So get yourselves ready for 5 sermons in a row on our sin. I'll be honest, there's actually a time when I've, not really enjoyed this time of preaching, because it's actually quite difficult to front up with such wonderful and beautiful Christians like yourselves and convince you that you're all a bunch of sinners, you see. But then I turn on the radio and I see the news and I see who you've elected as Prime Minister and Deputy, and I think, well, thanks for making my job easier. Our sin is no joke. But you don't have to come to church to realise that we mess up, that things go wrong in this world, not just, for no particular reason, because stuff happens, but we know that there's so much that goes on, and in some way, big and small, we're to blame. You can see it all over the news day by day. In some ways, I think this is what Paul was referring to when he said, all have sinned and have fallen short of the glory of God. It's easy to see. I don't really need to try and convince you that that stuff is happening in the world, that the world is, in part, a broken place, despite how God planned it and wanted it from the start. And that's where this morning's passage, we pick up God's blessing of Noah and his family. And you probably remember the flood story. At least I'm hoping you do. God launched a grand experiment in the human race. And then Adam and Eve were set in a garden, and they had just one rule. Just one rule: stay away from that tree. I don't know if it was a test or whether there was something really significant about that tree, but there had to be a rule, I guess. But they broke it. And then came their children, Cain and Abel. And you remember how those two brothers got along, well, like a house on fire, really. But rebellion against God and his love and his care seem to continue unabated, until the point where God says, I've had enough. And if you read through Genesis, you get to those sad, awful words where we hear, God saw that humanity had become thoroughly and totally evil, and every thought was always completely evil. The Lord regretted making human beings on earth. So God decided to end this experiment and to start again. And throughout all the world, there was only one person and his family that were righteous and blameless. It was Noah. So God warns Noah of the impending doom, the coming floods. And so he builds an ark and he brings on 2 of every animal, just as God commands. It does everything just right. And what we see is God is preserving a righteous remnant so that this human experiment can continue, can start again. And yet, things progress with mixed results. And if you continue reading through Genesis, you see that this experiment has not, in fact, cleaned out all of the evil from the world at all. And in a curious but very real kind of story, the first thing Noah does, after saying thanks to God, walking off the ark with his family and everybody, do you remember what he does? The first thing? He plants the first vineyard. He gets drunk and passes out naked on the floor. and his kids see him. It's in there, fair dinkum, you read it. You don't remember that story, do you? We like to skip over that bit and we go straight to the promise and the rainbow. Because Noah was righteous and blameless. But what we see is he was just quite an ordinary person, really. And even after the flood and after the promise, he messes up. And we're told that the two of the other sons had to walk backwards into his tent and drape a blanket over him so that they would not see his nakedness. And it's a curious story, really. I encourage you to go home and read it. It comes straight after where we finish up in chapter 9. And in some ways, I think this whole bit about the children seeing his nakedness is metaphorical about those times when we come unstuck. The things that we get wrong become visible to family or friends or the wider world. It's a very real kind of story, isn't it? The frailty of ordinary people, men and women, whatever kind, of every background. And so we see that even in spite of God's promise to his people, God's covenant that he wouldn't give up on us, the sinning and the mistakes, they continued. From Noah through his family and all the kids behind him and all those coming after, even right now to you and I. And in very many ways, we are that remnant, the people that God had left over in terms of the new chance of this experiment to work. And one of the very first symbols of the early church, you might not have known, was of an ark. I'm not sure if that's why churches were often built like a boat, upside down. I don't know, that just sparked off in my mind. But they saw themselves as that remnant, as the new experiment, if you like. But then the service here finishes and we go out and some of us will mess up. Maybe straight away, maybe we'll get a few days down the track before we do something silly. But it happens. But that is not the end of the story. By the grace of God, the human experiment continues. That's why we remember this promise. That's why we go back to this wonderful story of God putting the rainbow in the sky. And we remember that our sin is not the end. Our sin is not the final chapter or the final word, but God's grace is. God responds to our disappointing little experiment, the way we live our lives, the things that we get wrong and the things that go wrong, not with punishment, but with promise. God responds to all of our mess-ups not with condemnation, but covenant. Never again will he do the flood. Never again will he say, I've had enough, you guys are beyond redeeming, we'll start again with someone else. God says, never again will I do that. And what he offers instead is a promise. I will continue to love you. I will continue to work with you, no matter how badly you mess up. That's what the promise is, really. That God will continue to work with us. Not just a second chance, but a third and a fourth and a seventh and a 77th and all of that. God's promise in the rainbow is really that he won't try starting again. He'll just keep in conversation with us. He'll keep calling us back, no matter how far we wander. No matter, even if it's only a little bit. God's correction in our life is gentle and it is loving and it is kind. Never again will God give up on humanity. And just to make sure he doesn't forget his own promise, he puts a rainbow in the sky. So the story is not really about our sin at all, and the persistent nature of sin, that it's all pervasive. And as we said in our prayers, that conflict might be ever present in some places and in some people. It's not about that. It's actually a story about the persistent endurance of God's grace. God is steadfast. God is determined and boundless in his love. So for the 40 days of Lent, all this time, we can be thinking about repairing the damage that we might have done in this world and in this life, with our relationships in all the different directions. But in all of that, we want to remember God's promises. Because over and above any of our errors or our evil, we remember the grace of God that covers all of that, that keeps coming back to us. God keeps making promises to us. God keeps resuming that divine human conversation. He never lets us go. He never says, you've had too many chances. That one's done. Never. God continues to call, continues to be there for us, anytime and every time we turn around and seek him. And we here gather under that great truth, that God never gives up on us.